Welcome to part 3 of our series on publication ethics. My name is Dr. Charon Pierson. I'm in the faculty of the University of Texas, El Paso in the School of Nursing, and I'm also the editor-in-chief of the Journal of the American Academy of Nurse Practitioners and nurse author and editor. This part 3, we're going to talk about plagiarism, and this is an important problem that we are dealing with not only in publication but also with academics, with student papers. And I want to just provide a little bit of an explanation, I think, of why this is important and how we deal with it in the professional publications arena. So our objectives are to define plagiarism, including self-plagiarism and unintentional plagiarism, duplicate publication, and talk about some detection devices for plagiarism. We're going to talk a little bit about public domain, and then also how to avoid plagiarism when you're writing. So a definition of plagiarism is that you have accidentally or intentionally presented the work of somebody else as your own. So for example, if you copy and paste from something off of the internet and put it into your paper and do not attribute it, if it comes from a blog, for example, and it's not really a reference that you would normally put in a paper, but it's somebody's idea about something that you have been writing about, and you just take their words and put it in there, that is plagiarism. And the plagiarism detection programs that we have now will detect that very easily. There is an article in Nurse Author and Editor that I wrote in 2010 that talks about detecting and preventing plagiarism in publishing, and that is available on the Nurse Author and Editor website, and it will be available as part of the materials that accompany this series. So I want to talk to you about a case that was fairly typical of an article that I had received from a sole author. It appeared to be a capstone project for a graduate degree. And there was no statement of authorship. I mean, the author did not say, this is my own work, it's original, I followed the ICMJE guidelines as an author. But she did sign what we have all authors sign as a copyright transfer agreement. And we do that because one part of that agreement says that this is original work. So by signing that, this author had attested that this work was original and that she was submitting it. So we put it through the Authenticate similarity processing program that we have, and the index was 42% similarity. And I'm going to show you one that's not this particular piece. I don't think, but it's similar, and I did it because I'm trying to, I don't want to name anybody or anything for any of these cases that I'm discussing. These are really just general examples. So I want to talk about what this actual, what these reports actually look like. So I'm going to go to this similarity report. That name up there, Robert Piggers, is not the author. That's the person who submits the work. He's the managing editor of the journal. He submits the work to Authenticate, so that's why it shows up as with his name on it. But this is a 33% similarity index, and there's a couple of things that I want you to see here. First of all, here's the total similarity index up here. And if you're a student and you're used to using something like Turnitin, this will be very familiar to you. You will see that this looks like the kind of reports that you get. The one thing that you should know is if you submit your paper to Turnitin, before you submit it to a journal that uses Authenticate, it will not pick up any papers that are in the Turnitin database. So if you've submitted your paper to Turnitin, don't assume that it's going to be be labeled as plagiarized in the Authenticate system, because the two systems, although they're produced by the same company, they do not interact with each other. The Turnitin database is something entirely different from the Authenticate database. So the first thing is the 33% here, but then we want to look here at number 1, which we see there are 4% of the total words, or 317 words here, come from this particular article. Another 4% come from another article. Another 3% come from another article, and so on down the line. So when we look at this, and this is a static view of what we see, but I'll show you, if you go down and look for the matches in the document itself, you'll see they are highlighted in colors. So from number 2, there are, and I can look at this in a different view and I can see how close, I can see some of the words that have been changed. So for example, this statement here in green, part of this sentence, actually most of this sentence, with the result of with just a couple of changes of words, is taken from an article which is cited, but it's almost a verbatim copy of what is in that article. And you'll see as you go along, there are more number 2s, because remember, 4% of this article comes from this reference number 2. So you can see all this highlighted, colored material that shows how much verbiage is actually identical to the references that you have used. And even with changing a word or two here and there, that is not enough to and then adding a reference, that is not enough. That is really, you're still appropriating another person's words. If it's a direct quote, it has to be indirect. It has to be enclosed within quotation marks or indented appropriately based on the style manual that you're using. So this is a fairly common occurrence. Now, the number, people always ask me, what's the bottom line number? What number can it not exceed? I have had some fairly low numbers that I have rejected because there aren't that many. It depends, it's a mathematical calculation, so it depends on the amount of words in the document itself, the number of references, and I have to review each one of these individually, or someone has to review each one of these individually to make a decision. And if I see strings of things that are just taken from other material and there's really little synthesis of all the information, that's not a paper that I'm really interested in publishing. That's old news. That is not something that is new. But it may be enough for a student to get a graduate degree. But before we close this out, I want you to look at what COPE guidelines say about plagiarism in a submitted manuscript. And this is the COPE guideline specifically for that. Here's their website up here, publicationethics.org. They have a lot of these flowcharts. So this is suspected plagiarism in a submitted manuscript. This is not something that's been published. It's just being reviewed. And I want you to look down at the bottom here, because this has serious implications for students. So if I contact this author and I ask her for an explanation and she has no explanation, or she says, oh, I didn't realize that this was not acceptable, or I don't know how that happened. There's any number of things that people say in response to this question. If you look down here at the bottom, it actually says that I should consider informing the author's superior, their department chair, their dean, their boss, the person that the institution that granted them the degree. There are serious implications resulting from plagiarism that occurs in students' works. Now, the reality is that I don't have the resources to do that. I can't be contacting individual people saying, oh, did you know your student plagiarized your paper? Basically, as journal editors, we let that go unless it's in a published manuscript. If it's in a published manuscript, that's an entirely different story. But I just want everybody to be aware of the fact that plagiarism is being taken extremely seriously these days. And it's not worth jeopardizing your degree or your career for that. So the recommendation basically says I should notify the dean or the person's chair of their committee, something like that. And in reality, we don't do that. But believe me, we make notes of people who submit plagiarized manuscripts. And when we see something come in from another person, from another manuscript come in from that same person, rather, we seriously consider whether or not we want to deal with this author again. So it can jeopardize your future, so be careful of that. It's very common in political circles. People appropriate ideas, and it's common in the arts. There have been suits about somebody stole my song, somebody stole the words to various things. And those kinds of cases are adjudicated in the courts sometimes if they're lawsuits. But this was a congressional report challenging prior research on climate change. And there were 35 of 91 pages that were completely copied from another source without attribution. And nothing ever came of that. This came from the Authenticate blog. So people are watching what other people are doing, particularly people in the public arena. And this is the most astonishing thing, I think, that's happened. And that is that some institutions have revoked doctoral degrees from people who have plagiarized their dissertations. So the first case that I saw, and this came from Retraction Watch, this was Carl Theodor Gutenberg, and he was stripped of his PhD because he had plagiarized his thesis, and he had been Germany's defense minister. So people in high places are getting, people are looking at what they're producing, what they're writing, what they have produced in the past, and they are following up on some of these things. He apologized for it. This second person also, I'm not sure if she was German also, I think, or German or Belgian maybe, former president of the European Parliament, but she had significant plagiarism in her thesis, and she never commented on it. And then another German politician was stripped of his PhD, and he blamed the university for the problem. So there are a lot of reactions, different reactions that people have to these things. But if you're in the public limelight, you know that someone is going to be looking very carefully at what you're saying and recording it and checking it for possible plagiarism. So what's the problem with plagiarism? Well, work that's published is published under a copyright, and publishers generally hold the copyright. The copyright is supposed to protect the work of the author or the creator. There are copyrights available for other things. And authors generally transfer the copyright to the publisher. Now, the publisher makes a claim on the copyright for it on behalf of the author, but actually holds the exclusive right to publish the copyrighted material. Some people don't believe that they have signed over copyright, and in fact they have. So when you do publish, you do have to sign some forms and just read what they're saying, because there may be things you cannot do with what you have developed. So permissions, this has a lot to do with permissions. What you can reprint with permission has to be, the permission has to be granted by the copyright holder. And sometimes academics in particular think that they hold the copyright to their own work, and they don't. The publisher holds the copyright. And sometimes there's a fee to reproduce things. And I've had authors who have submitted manuscripts with a table that they wanted to reproduce from some other journal, and the journal wants to charge them $200 for permission to reprint the table. So as you're writing your articles, be careful what you think you need to reproduce. You can refer readers to other sources to find things rather than reproduce them. But it's a legal issue, but it also involves money. And so when it involves money, you know, there may be problems. There is also something about fair use. Fair use is very difficult to describe. It has something to do with the percent of material that's taken from another source, even though it's taken with proper attribution. So for example, in the journal that I edit, frequently people want to copy something from the DSM, the Diagnostics and Statistical Manual from the American Psychological Association. They have a very specific definition of fair use. They say that 500 words from a published APA publication is fair use. But if you have a 750-word article, which is basically like a letter to the editor or an editorial, and you've taken 500 words from APA, that really isn't fair use. So you have to take that, you have to interpret that appropriately. But you can copy or reproduce 500 words without paying a fee. That's basically what they're talking about. So, how do you acknowledge your sources? You've got referencing styles that are either given to you by your professors, your university for your dissertation or thesis. Journals have different referencing styles. I don't know how many. There are hundreds of different referencing styles. The most common ones are the American Medical Association, the Vancouver style, the American Psychological Association, Chicago style, several MLA. Those are probably the most common ones. Verbatim text must be enclosed in quotation marks and referenced. References normally include the page, and if it's electronic material, there are specific guidance about how to determine the paragraph number or how to exactly locate the quote in an electronic document. I already showed you that changing a few words or combining a couple of sources that's just very similar to what's already been published is a form of plagiarism. So it's really important that you learn to detect, to paraphrase and determine when you're close to plagiarism. You can also plagiarize your own work, and that happens sometimes in with people who are doing research and they're getting several manuscripts published out of one research study, one method, one big large research study, and they tend to copy and take pieces from previous publications that they've made. You should try to rephrase that if appropriate. There's a controversy as to whether self-plagiarism is really plagiarism, but that may be a journal decision that has to be made. But this is a good website, the OWL, and that's OWL stands for Online Writing Laboratory at Purdue. There are many others. I just happen to know this site and I use it a lot. I direct people to it. They have some good paraphrase examples in there. And so if you are teaching students, you need to hold students accountable for their writing and the fact that they must be paraphrasing appropriately so that their work is not does not constitute plagiarism. So if you want to check your own work for plagiarism, there are academic subscriptions, like for example Turnitin. There are a couple of websites on here for plagiarism.org is one that have some additional resources, and the commercial subscription base that we use is Authenticate. There are a couple of free sites, Plagiarism Checker. You can put a few words into Google sometimes and see if you can find a match, but they have to be words that are quite unique. Otherwise, it's you know, if you put in very common words, you'll get millions of hits. There's another site that I just found fairly recently called plagiarism.bloomfieldmedia.com. That has a fair amount of information about plagiarism, and it also has a downloadable plagiarism checker that's free. I'm not sure how good it is and how much it will pick up. The value of things like Authenticate is that they have access to all of the published material for all of the member publishers in the Authenticate database. So there's millions of articles that your paper will be compared against. But those are some resources that you can use as a writer and as a faculty person to discourage the plagiarism that seems to be a problem throughout academia and in publishing. I want to just briefly mention public domain. People sometimes say, well, I don't need to get permission for that because it's in the public domain. Being in the public domain does not mean that it's publicly available on a website. There's a lot of things publicly available on websites that are not in the public domain. But it originally meant that there was no copyright on the material anymore. So, for example, the works of Shakespeare are in the public domain. Shakespeare does not, or Shakespeare's family does not hold the copyright. Let me see. Well, there are resources to check about on public domain, but public domain, oh, I have a better example on the next slide, I forgot. There we go. So one of the things I'm in geriatrics, so one of the things that's very commonly referenced is the geriatric depression scale, or the Savage scale. Now this is actually in the public domain because it was research funded originally by NIH, and research funded by NIH is supposed to remain in the public domain. So you can actually download a copy at the website here, stanford.edu/Savage, and you can use it freely in practice, as opposed to, for example, the mini mental status exam, where you have to actually pay to use that. The Savage scale, or the geriatric depression scale, is available as an Android app on your Android phone, and you can print it in an article if you want to without paying a fee. But you can't claim that you wrote it. This is actually something that is protected by a copyright, but it is still in the public domain and protected by an intellectual copyright. So the funny thing about the geriatric depression scale, if you go to that website for Dr. Savage, he says you can freely use this without paying any fee, but if you want to make a donation, you can donate to my favorite charity, which is the California Trout Association, apparently. So just donate if you feel obligated to pay some money someplace. So, how to avoid, this is your own personal strategy, how to avoid accidental plagiarism. Make sure that you're very organized in your note-taking, carefully cite your source, and if you're scribbling things down and you're not really making good notes, you're going to be confused when you go to write. Did I really write that myself, or did that actually come from the article? You should practice paraphrasing and try to synthesize the information as much as possible to organize and support your arguments. Another good suggestion is to retain your original sources for rechecking, either as an electronic file or a paper file, and organize them so that you know which resources you have used in each paper that you're writing. It will come in handy when you have to do page proofs. If you have not used the appropriate reference style, or if you have not included everything in your reference that you are supposed to be, that is supposed to be there. So here's another case of duplicate publication. Now this is basically self-plagiarism, which I briefly discussed earlier. Excuse me. We had a submission from an author, sole author, that had been published in our journal. This is the same author who had submitted 2 plagiarized manuscripts that were rejected without review or without publication. Well, the COPE guidelines basically say all of this author's work should be considered suspect. And so as the editor, I had to go back and look at this previously published article and decide whether or not I thought there was any problem with it. So I did, and I found another article that was very similar, had a very similar title, published in an entirely different journal, but seemed to be relating the same information, the same study, the same findings. So I contacted editorial board members and had 4 people review it, and they basically decided that they thought anywhere between 75 and 80% of the 2 articles were identical. So he or she had copied large portions of of one manuscript onto another manuscript and not changed anything, and submitted it to 2 different journals, and we had to retract this publication. So that was what the guidelines say, and our journal did not hold the original copyright. The other journal had published previously, although they published within like a month or 2 of each other, so there would be no way for us to have known this, but this was an unfortunate situation that the author was trying to maximize the number of publications out of a research study, and ended up, another term that this is called salami slicing, you've probably heard that. This is really not acceptable unless you're reporting new data. And you definitely should not be copying large passages of something that you have previously submitted. So again, in summary, you want to maintain good note-taking behaviors, learn how to paraphrase appropriately. If you have access to plagiarism detection software, use it. Use it for your students. If you're a student, use it yourself. Learn from it. And you should report suspected plagiarism or duplicate publication if you are finding it in the literature. You can contact the editor of the journal. And then, as an author, you need to adhere to copyright and fair use guidelines in everything that you write.